All right, thank you everyone for joining this evening. We'll begin the meeting shortly. This is the third public meeting for the third round of public engagement for the Little Manatee South Urban Expansion Area Study. And while we wait for everyone to arrive, please let us know what you think and what you hope to take away from tonight's meeting, or if you have any questions, you can go ahead and type them in the Q&A box. If you need any technical assistance, we have our team here to help you out. And again, to open the Q&A box, just look for the Q&A button at the edge of your screen. And for those who don't see the Q&A button in their options, we do have a picture of it on this slide, so that way you can go ahead and find it. But we will start in just a minute or two here. All right, we'll go ahead and get started. I see people are still trickling in, but do want to remind everyone that this meeting is being recorded and will be available on our website afterwards. But to get started, today's meeting agenda, we'll go through a little bit of welcome, introductions of the project team, go over today's meeting purpose, and then we're going to go back into some of the background about the study, and then we're going to go ahead and start comparing some of the three growth scenarios that we've prepared about how this scenarios in general, how they were developed. We're also going to go through the overview of the current plan, go through each of the scenarios, and go also through the technical review findings from each of the county departments. And then we're also going to review what we heard from the community and how that feedback was worked into the scenarios as well. We also have some ideas for further refinement that we'll go through as well. And then we have a quick wrap up at the end. So again, this meeting is scheduled to take approximately 60 minutes. The majority of that time will be the review of all the materials that we've had from our in-person meetings last Thursday and this past Saturday. So it is a lot of material. We want to make sure that everybody understands it. Again, we will be spending the majority of the time reviewing this material. And all that information has been posted to the project website, and a copy of this slide deck will also be posted onto the website, as well as the recording. And we have these, again, everything on the website, as you could see, planhillsboro.org, LMS UEA. So some introductions on and project roles. My name is Sofia Garantiva. I am with the Planning Commission. I'm one of the co-project managers along with Andrea Papandrew, who's also online. Also online from the team is Jay Collins. Not online, but also part of the team is Victoria Duran. And online for our tech support is Daniel. Uh, from the consultant team, we have Stephen Benson, who is the project lead for the consultant team. We also have Andrea Fernandez, Alan Steinbeck, Fatima Elcott, and Jason Gonzalez. And again, the purpose of this meeting, this is the third round of community meetings for the Little Manatee South Urban Expansion Area Planning Study. And this is the third meeting in that round. And the study, again, will be completed in 4 rounds. This is a familiar graphic. We've shown this at each of our meetings so far. But as you can see, we're now at the round 3 highlighted, taking place right now during the summer of 2026. So before we wrap up this round, we're going to be taking uh, all the input again on the 3 scenarios. And then from there, we will finalize it into one final map and final plan and recommendations that will be, again, presented to the Board of County Commissioners at the end of the study. And so how to participate in this meeting, again, you could submit your questions and comments at any time by clicking on the Q&A box at the edge of the screen. You can like a comment on what others have written. Also, you will see in the chat box, the host will put uh, links. So we'll be putting some links in there as well for you to reference. And then again, this meeting is being recorded. So this will be available for viewing afterwards if you need to reference it back while you're doing the survey. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing and have the consultant team go ahead and start reviewing the materials. Thank you.
Okay, we are going to go ahead and review each of the boards that were presented at the previous 2 meetings for round 3. My name is Stephen Benson. I'm the consultant project manager with H.W. Lochner, and did just want to touch a little bit about this study. This is being prepared by the Planning Commission, which is an independent multi-jurisdictional planning agency that develops the comprehensive plans that guide growth over the next 20 plus years and makes independent recommendations to the Board of County Commissioners. This study was initiated in March of 2024. County commissioners directed staff to study 2 areas for possible expansion of the urban service area. These boards are going to cover one of them. This is the Little Manatee South Urban Expansion Area Study. Round 1, we focused on presenting those existing conditions. Round 2, we asked you to help us map this area by the year 2050 using generalized place types. And now we are at round 3, and we're going to be showing you 3 different scenarios that were used that were developed based upon the information you gave us during round 2, as well as the information from round 1 and all the public comments and feedback that we've received so far. What round 3 is going to tell us is that these scenarios are going to be used for information to build a preferred scenario. The 3 scenarios that we show you today, none of them individually will be carried forward. We're going to be taking the best information from each of them and using that to craft a round 4 preferred alternative scenario that we'll bring back for more refinement along with you, asking you more questions about what to change, what to keep the same, and what you like and what you don't like. So a couple of things we want to make sure is clear, especially about how to read these boards. Most of the boards compare the 3 scenarios on one topic using real numbers where we are able to provide them. Where a topic can't be measured, we simply describe how the scenarios differ relative to each other. Um, One of the questions that we received was why compare these scenarios beyond the year 2050 if we're focused on 2050? That's a really good question. The reason is because by 2050, all 3 scenarios add a similar amount of housing. What differs is how much each scenario consumes land in order to do that. Because land consumed early is not available later, these boards compare the scenarios across the entire study area beyond 2050, where differences are visible from one to another. It's also important to note that these boards are not commitments. The comprehensive plan is revisited every 5 to 10 years. So the area that we've identified as for future study is simply areas that we're not going to be recommending anything with by the end of this study for the year 2050. So there are areas that would be looked at in the future potentially simply because that's the routine practice is to restudy and revisit the plan every 5 to 10 years. Each of the county departments that are affected by these scenarios were asked to weigh in, and their input is going to appear throughout these boards as a guidepost. And so what we want to convey is that these are simply the department's view, not a final decision. Your role at this meeting is really to provide us with your input and help us shape that future round four preferred alternative. So we're going to be looking at the Little Manatee South Study area that covers about 9,500 acres south of the Little Manatee River, bounded by US 41 to the west, I-75 to the east, and the Manatee County line to the south. Existing preserved land in this area includes Cockroach Bay Aquatic Preserve, Little Manatee South River State Park, as well as lands that are controlled by the Environmental Lands Acquisition and Protection Program, ELAP. These anchor the corridor and they really reinforce the concept that rose during round two, which is the idea of restoring and creating a wildlife and floodplain corridor throughout the Little Manatee area. Sections of it exist, but it's not continuous. And so we'll talk about how each of the scenarios attempt to do that and to what degree. In these scenarios, there were certain things that limited development and influenced why we placed certain place types in some areas, but not others. That includes environmentally sensitive lands, flood zones, the coastal high hazard area, and other environmental data sets like wellhead protection areas, and then, of course, the Little Manatee River itself. 8 data sets in total were screened that helped us develop environmental sensitivity ratings. And so we focus on the areas that were least environmentally sensitive based upon the suggestions that you guys had in round two. There are some questions about what was already assumed, and I think this was already been a comment that was put into the chat. What I'll say, I think, about the future interchange is that it does appear in all three scenarios. The reason for that is because FDOT is funding a study to look at a future interchange somewhere along I-75 between the Manatee County line and the Little Manatee River. A specific location has not been selected yet. And so the gold star that you're going to see on these maps is really just a placeholder until that study is able to make a recommendation. The good news is the feedback that we get from you today as part of this process can be provided back to FDOT for them to be able to consider as they make that decision and produce alternatives that they're going to evaluate later next year. The Sundance area is addressed by an idea that we have produced to potentially create a bypass corridor, and we'll talk about that later on in this presentation. So looking briefly at what we heard from the round two workshops, this map is an attempt to take all of the different comments and all the different dots that were placed and try to reflect them as best as we could. It's a synthesis. And so what participants from the round two process said, in short, is really focused on the top right in the white box. So we heard that you want to preserve natural areas and create a wildlife corridor, preferably that connects the Little Manatee River to the Cockroach Creek Greenway, which already exists as a preserved land. Using the Curiosity Creek corridor that runs just east of I-75 and dips down into Manatee County and then pops back up and connects to Cockroach Creek. And then see that corridor extended west and up out into Cockroach Bay across and under US 41. So that is a piece of feedback that we heard from you, as well as looking at other corridors like that that already exist in the topography of the land in this area and trying to reconnect those and preserve those as part of a conservation priority. Some additional feedback that we heard was to keep new development away from Sundance and use these conservation corridors as a buffer. Uh, Also, less cut-through traffic, specifically in the Sundance area. If the I-75 interchange does proceed, relocate it away from Lightfoot Road, for example, down to Buckeye Road in Manatee County. And we also heard that there was a desire to see limited industrial and employment. Additionally, we heard that some folks would like us to cluster mixed use and town center development along US 41 rather than on the east end of the study area. We also heard that industrial only should be non-hazardous. So looking at uses such as warehouse, lumber, and not oil, petroleum, or chemicals that would potentially be hazardous uses to people living nearby or to the environment itself. So looking at how these scenarios were developed, these are three distinct directions. They're potential futures, but they are not predictions. Each scenario sort of extrapolates out an unconstrained demand along a different trend. That trend is drawn from assumptions and information that was produced in the real estate market analysis, looking at what's happening in this market area and what's driving the private sector, what's going to be driving future petitions for rezonings and comprehensive plan amendments. The information that drives those decisions in the private sector is information that we want to be aware of and that we have documented for you as part of the work that's already been done and that was presented to you during round one. Each of these scenarios is meant to convey a very distinct flavor of development, so the trade-offs can be effectively weighed. And so the best aspects of each can be carried forward into a single preferred scenario in round four. On each of these maps, you are going to see us identify a specific area that is associated with a potential first phase, or what we call the 2050 phase. That 2050 phasing area was identified using the same set of inputs as the scenario maps themselves. So looking at the market analysis, looking at the environmental land screening, looking at the adopted community plan, the input that you gave us in round two, as well as input that we received from Hillsborough County individual departments. It reflects the growth that would be needed to accommodate within the urban service area by 2050 under the current framework in the comprehensive plan. Um, the remainder shows what each pattern would set in motion beyond that horizon. So everything that we show you that's beyond the year 2050 is really up for future evaluation, future determination, and it's not something that we're going to be making a recommendation on as part of this study. Your mapping was carried forward in the development of these maps by the place types. Conservation areas were drawn based upon the environmental sensitivity screening, the ELAP priorities, and the feedback that you provided to us, which, of course, as I mentioned, was to preserve existing natural areas and restore corridors for water flow and for wildlife habitat. And then also want to mention that one of the scenarios shows a little bit more intensity, and we're going to speak a little bit about why once we get into those maps. Um, for those of you that are new to this process uses what we call place types, which really are general descriptions of multiple different types of land uses. And they're not zoning, they're not future land use categories themselves, and they're not a specific development proposal. They're really just types of future places that might exist. The reason why that matters is because each place type carries different trade-offs for preserving natural and agricultural land, access to goods and services, housing choice, and the balance of jobs to housing. These are all issues that are addressed in the comprehensive plan as well as in the Little Manatee South Community Plan. As you review these three scenario maps, the colors correspond to these specific place types, and the scenarios differ mainly in which place types are used and how much land each place type occupies. So we're going to go through just the place types that did move forward into these three scenarios. The first place type is actually a combination of some of the place types for those of you that participated in round two. This place type, which you'll see on the maps in the orange color, is indicated by rural reserve or priority for conservation. This is developed or undeveloped areas that are set aside for land conservation. It can also include areas that are already agricultural, already public open space, or natural land preserves like wetlands, wildlife habitat, watershed, and floodplain buffers. And one of the reasons why we did cluster multiple place types together as part of this place type is because much of the area that we're going to be showing you has already been developed. It is not currently in a natural undeveloped state. Um, Much of the land that we are showing is agricultural land. A lot of it is row crops, and those row crop parcels do carry some environmental impact currently. So the reason why this place type is shown is because what we're indicating with this is to maintain what is there today, but also to take everything that's shown in orange and pull it out and identify what lands within that orange area are the most important for environmental conservation. So what we're recommending is restoring, again, those wildlife corridors that we heard from you during round two were so important. And so those are the areas that would get taken out and filtered and prioritized for either future acquisition or for other methods of protection. If it's currently an agricultural and privately owned, we are recommending some different policy tools and some different programs that are available throughout the state that we can borrow and recommend be replicated to put those into a program where they can be set aside for natural land restoration in the future. And we'll talk more about that once we get to our ideas at the end of this slide deck presentation. The rural estates and large lot homes are also shown in orange, and that's again because these are areas that are currently in existence today. We are not recommending these areas change that fall below that orange designation. The rural residential community is one that was carried forward into one of the place types. Again, this place type is represented by clusters of homes in a rural context. So you can see there the image on the left, clusters of closely spaced single family and small scale multifamily dwellings in sort of a town-like setting surrounded by open space, either natural or agricultural. And again, these agricultural areas and the natural areas would be protected in some way, either through conservation easements or through other land use restrictions. This place type, it's important to note, may also include some shops, services, and institutional uses, essentially anything that would be needed to support a small town. And that's explained here on the right. So if you think of a small town and what uses might exist there, that's essentially what you might expect in the rural residential designation. Suburban residential, this is the predominant pattern of development throughout most of Central Florida. This is represented by low-density residential neighborhoods with single-family homes that are separated from commercial areas. This you're going to see on the map in that teal color that's shown in the top right. Medium density residential, again, the images on the screen provide a good representation of what this looks like. These are primarily attached residential housing developments in a compact urban pattern and can include anything from low-rise multifamily buildings all the way to garden apartment style buildings. You also might see some neighborhoods serving commercial uses, as well as things like schools. Again, things that would be needed or expected to support this type of a place. And again, this area is going to be shown on the maps. It is only used in one of the scenarios, and it's shown in a brown color. Town or village center. This is one of the higher density place types that we're showing that does incorporate homes clustered around a local commercial center. This could be a main street, a square, or a downtown. There are several of these, especially in a newer development context throughout Hillsborough County. For example, in the West Chase community, the West Park Village neighborhood is a good example of a town or village center as part of a larger development. And again, this might be incrementally developed over time or as part of a master planned community. Suburban commercial, this sort of is a parallel to suburban residential. Again, this is shown in the cobalt blue color on the maps and is represented by the types of places that you can see here shown on the slide. Employment center. This is a combination of two of the place types that we presented to you in round two. This combines the industrial place type as well as the corporate park place type. So things that essentially produce jobs. So employment centers like hospitals, research and development, restaurants, offices, light industrial, and institutions. The primary purpose is employment with little to no residential. There may be some residential, but it's predominantly non-residential. We would also see light industrial, some commercial, and some institutional uses as well. And this is how all of the place types stack up against each other. Um, just to give you a sense, again, along the entire scale and the gradient of what to expect, really throughout the entire Tampa Bay region, you can see that this area, certainly the place types that we're using skew more toward the undeveloped and very low density developed part of the transect map here, with very few uses and very few place types that you might see in a more urban or more developed context. Again, this board was shown in round two. This just speaks to the differences in each place type and what those trade-offs are and what they might be in terms of different goals and objectives from each of those different land use patterns, from the place types that produce more people and jobs or support more people and jobs to the place types that require more land or consume more land to support the same number of people. This slide, for those of you that participated in round two, speaks to how the place types that were mapped in round two really were equated and converted over to the scenario map colors that you're going to see here in the next couple of slides. Again, we did consolidate the natural areas, agriculture, and rural estate large lot into that rural reserve priority for conservation place type, and then we consolidated the corporate park and industrial place types into the employment center place type. But everything else here that you're seeing is going to be the same as what you saw in round two. A couple things that we're going to talk about as we go into the scenarios. We were asked to show a no build option. That was one of the comments that we received in round two. We unfortunately cannot show a no build option because there really isn't one. State law does allow property owners to petition to develop land, and this study area currently is not fully built out under the current future land use map. So that means that there is still more development allowed under the current plan. And so as a proxy for a no build option, what we're showing you today, in addition to the three scenarios, is the current plan and what the current plan allows. What the current plan allows is an additional, on top of what exists today, 1,022 homes, an additional 2,556 residents is what that would equate to by 2050, plus somewhere on the order of 110 to 410,000 square feet of non-residential development. And that includes correcting for the obvious constraints that exist in a rural setting for an area that does not have access to urban services. So that 110 to 410,000 square feet really can take the form of uses that would support the predominant agricultural nature of the area with limited commercial, light industrial, and spread out parcel by parcel across the entire area. So not clustered in one spot, but spread out evenly throughout. That is the maximum that what would be allowed under all of these different constraints. What the current plan does not do is establish a priority framework for how to continue pursuing conservation lands. It does not identify wildlife corridor preservation or a bypass around Sundance. It also does not set any guidance in terms of future infrastructure phasing to support the growth that is recommended. The development, of course, would occur one parcel at a time at whatever pattern each parcel takes. So again, even if no change to the plan occurs as a result of this study, it will not stop individual property owners from being able to petition for a land use change. So part of what we're doing with this process is building the record. So if that does occur in the future, there's something to compare it and weigh it against that reflects input that we took from you and tried to put together into a cohesive strategy. So looking more specifically at the current plan, this is the adopted future land use map for the Little Manatee South urban expansion area. The boundaries of the study area are shown in red. Um, about 70% of the study area has the future land use designation of agricultural rural 1 to 5. That is shown in that lime green color that's so predominant on this map. That category permits one home per 5 acres, with some neighborhood commercial, office, or industrial uses. The reason why I say some is because those uses have limitations where they're allowed and where they're enabled within the green area on the map. So only certain places within the green um, allow for those non-residential uses to occur. And those non-residential uses include agricultural and mining related uses as well in certain locations. And this slide shows sort of a direct comparison of those colors on the map to the amount of land that they comprise, and then describe what each of those permits. So this that again, that most common designation is the agricultural rural 1 to 5. That's just over 6,000 acres, 70% of the area. Um, the second most common category is residential 2. That is 11% of the study area. And that category allows 2 homes per acre, as well as some neighborhood commercial, office, or multi-purpose projects up to a limited amount. Natural preservation is the third most common category in the study area, about 890 acres, about 10%. That is comprised of open space or passive natural parks, generally speaking. And then other categories that exist are residential 1, which allows 1 home per acre with some non-residential, public, quasi-public, which is represented by government and public facilities, as well as public quasi uses, public quasi-public uses, excuse me, such as churches or schools. Also, light industrial. There's about 99 acres in light industrial. Um, more on the limited scale for that use. And again, that's just 1% of the study area. And then about 127 acres in the study area has the designation of residential 4 or residential 6. And those categories respectively allow for 4 to 6 homes per acre and limited neighborhood commercial or non-residential uses up to a limited amount. So this is the image of the adopted community plan, the Little Manatee South community plan that was adopted about 15 years ago. This plan was one of the many inputs that we used to build off of. There were some assumptions and some very clear strategies and ideas set forth in this plan. And it does call for a number of things that we did recommend to carry forward. There are some assumptions in this plan that have not come to fruition yet. For instance, the plan does contemplate a passenger rail corridor down US 41 that did not come to fruition and has not been progressed substantially to this at this time. So some of those assumptions we did have to consider going forward, and we'll point out how the scenarios that we're going to show you are similar to, but also maybe a little bit different from the community plan vision, and then get your feedback on those differences and if you think they're good ideas or not so good ideas. And then I'll take this time to transition over to Alan on our team, who is going to provide an overview of each of the 3 scenarios. And then before we wrap up, we'll talk about how they compare to one another and then the next steps.
Thanks, Stephen. I wanted to make a quick point about this map and this plan too that Stephen didn't mention. And while there is a lot of similarities between what was inherently adopted in here, what we're talking about today, one of the details that I thought was important was this clustering of development, hamlets and villages, and you see the word no strip centers on the bottom. So clearly the residents at the time who participated in the staff that supported them were looking for a vision that was a little different than your typical suburban style development and even rural development in the county, hoping for something a little more thoughtful to happen down there. And it is true that was done some time ago. There hasn't been a lot of investment in the area, and there certainly hasn't been that type of investment in the area happening. So I think it's a story of one of policy being land use policy and urban service area boundary policy, but also infrastructure development and lack of that infrastructure to support that kind of thing happening. So the area has been sort of stable for a long time, and we recognize that going into the conversation. You can go to the next one. We did develop 3 scenarios. I've been working on scenario planning for a long time throughout my career, and it's important that we read them as conceptual. We've been asked to understand and highlight some of the implications of having this area be developed and having urban services brought to it. With urban services and infrastructure comes demand for development, but also there's demand for development in this part of the region, um, both housing and jobs. And in order to provide a recommendation to the Board of County Commissioners, it's important for us to look at some of the what ifs of specifically different land use policies on this area and the associated topics of transportation and infrastructure versus doing something that really dialed in very closely on infrastructure. So for me, this is a kind of a land use exercise at its heart, with an ear towards everything that would need to be considered in terms of other infrastructure types. And so we took the land use part of this very seriously, trying to think of both the demand that occurs there, but also how to um, imbue this process with good placemaking practices and trying to figure out what types of development really were appropriate, how they worked in terms of land efficiency in particular, as Stephen mentioned. There's the smaller your footprint for accommodating new development, the less land gets built upon. And so we try to tease that theme out a little bit, but also compare sort of your typical suburban development that happens in the county and is happening now across the region with some other concepts that we think are useful to consider in shaping the development in a way that's going to be beneficial and less impactful in certain ways, especially on the conservation and the environmental side. But the first scenario, scenario one, is I don't want to quite call it business as usual, but it's about as close as you can get for any of the scenarios that we've put together. And what I mean by that is if market forces were perfectly fluid and sort of looked at the roadway network and the infrastructure and the planned new road that's going through and the type of development that occurs in this part of the world, which is largely single family, but with some mixed multifamily in. Um, I would say this probably represents a market-based scenario where we've shown suburban commercial, the place type Stephen was describing along 41, and at potentially at the location of the proposed or potential interchange. Um, and this would include a mix of at those blue areas, which are the commercial areas, you would have a mixture of goods and services and probably some office and other non-retail type of development occurring in those places. And the suburban residential in the middle would represent a fairly large footprint of development with the largest amount of area developed of the scenarios at 3,800 acres. Um, and accommodating 15,000 homes in the future and 23,000 jobs. The that suburban residential area would be a mixture of medium density residential development, single family homes, but in almost every case today, with development at a large scale, developers are wanting to mix in apartments and other types of housing units somewhere, usually within commercial areas, but sometimes embedded within the residential areas to meet the demands of a diverse housing types that are required. Um, there's one of the biggest demographics to have grown in housing is the single person household, which is more than doubled in recent times. And so there's a high demand for smaller units and not so much how individual houses in certain places. So this scenario is suburban in nature. You see in the orange areas of conservation. So even though the footprint is rather big, there's areas proposed for conservation, mostly west of 41 and south along the county line, but also within the area of the river itself. Next one. Scenario two is one where we were trying to demonstrate the benefits of the best practices in town center development and clustering development in specific places where we have shown town center locations in various parts of the study area. And these would be places where you would have a mixture of uses. You might have multi-story buildings. You would ideally have some park and walk environments and visitable places that actually add value to the area and feel like destinations. Um, these 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 kinds of places are being created throughout the state and around the region, where you see commercial development, you see restaurants, retail mixed in with a mix of housing types, oftentimes with people living very near and close by and mixed in with non-residential development. And so they tend to be a little more developed and a little more intensive, but they have a much smaller footprint than your typical suburban development and can have housing associated with them in the single family department, depending on how big that footprint gets and how much of the area around the town center is put into that kind of land use. You can see in this one, we've shown the rural reserve and priorities for conservation, which clustering the development within the town centers allows for a bigger footprint of emphasis on conservation, and a much longer view of any of that land in the interior between I-75 and 41 being developed. This one has the limited amount of land, only 700 acres of the 9,000 some acres in the study area would be developed in this case, demonstrating the efficiency of how this type of development can accommodate new people and jobs in the area. I think one of the downsides of this is that you may have a slightly lower mix of housing types, especially limited opportunity for single family homes in the mixture, and also a limited amount of land for some of the more land hungry employment uses that may be of interest from an economic development point of view for the county and the area. Next one. And then scenario three, where we've kind of hybridized this a little bit already, but we're showing some town center areas up to the north on 41 in the more traditionally developed part of this part of the county, where our hope was that those could be improved and maybe not intensely developed in the short run, but have a little more choice and a little more quality of place and services and goods for the many people who already live up there. I think you're in a little bit of a desert when it comes to certain things, even though you may like that. Some people want access to that kind of stuff. We have, in this case, employment centers, what I would point to in purple, where those are generally more geared towards strict employment and more lower intensity office parks and corporate headquarters and things like that. I know that sounds kind of strange to say, given that this is such a rural area today, but the interstate access and any future investment in here might lend itself to some larger employers wanting to find cheaper land with good accessibility, and be able to inhabit those kinds of places. Therefore, the capacity for job development in this scenario is the highest. It says 76,000 jobs on here. That's the capacity to carry those jobs within these land uses. It doesn't mean we're forecasting them, but oftentimes you want to have some accommodation for different types of job development to optimize the ability for people to invest in your community and bring good paying jobs to the area, which is something that I think is important. We've also shown in here rural community and rural reserves, with the mix of conservation, showing those more creative categories that have things like cluster development, prioritizing the preservation of rural lands within development, so you're not building on the whole piece of property, and having a little bit different flavor for residential development, where you don't have your typical suburban development, but you have something that is rural by design, which was an old phrase used in our industry to describe places that respect rural place type, but still have accommodation for new homes and sort of blend in with the landscape as much as possible, and also have a higher order of environmental considerations associated with them. So those are my summaries of the scenarios, and I think we're going back to Stephen to talk about some of the numbers here.
Sure. So, what you saw on each of those slides were three different potential futures, as well as the current plan. So that 2,500 homes, additional homes, is what is permitted by the current comp plan. If that were to continue on into the future toward 2050. So that's essentially what can be built without any changes to the adopted comp plan. That's what that 2,500 number represents. Part of what the study is doing is it's evaluating that relative to what the demand is, both not just in Little Manatee South itself, but in the surrounding market areas. So looking at Little Manatee, but also looking at Ruskin, Apollo Beach, Waimama, and then down just south of the Manatee County line in the communities just south of here. The reason why that's relevant is because that market information drives the pressure that's being put on Little Manatee South. So if we can quantify that and decide as a community, based upon where we see the market going today, what that demand is going to look like, it's going to put us in a better position to validate the assumptions and validate the recommendations from the previous community plan, or to recommend that those assumptions be revisited. So looking at each of the three scenarios, they each vary in terms of housing, in terms of the amount of population they would accommodate, the amount of jobs that they would enable, the amount of acres that are developed across each one, or that would be changed through development. They also vary based upon the amount of land that was shown for rural reserve, or for a priority for conservation. That was that orange area. And they also vary in terms of the amount of acres that had no change proposed at all. And you can see those differences here shown on the screen. Um, what's important to note, though, is that by 2050, that is where the 15,000 homes was really the cutoff in terms of what would need to be accommodated within the urban service area by the year 2050 to maintain 80% growth within the urban service area boundaries, which is an adopted policy in the comprehensive plan. And that was that target that we set to draw the cutoff for 2050. So the beyond 2050 figures are not commitments. The comprehensive plan is revisited. And so each of these scenarios show how much land each path would leave available unchanged for the future. So looking more relatively at the performance, this might be a little bit easier to read and compare. The current plan showed the lowest, of course, amount of new housing opportunities. And then scenario one, two, and three. Scenario one showed a lower amount, but not as low as the current plan. Scenario two and scenario three showed higher amounts in terms of the amount of housing they could accommodate. In terms of residential development, the current plan shows really the lowest amount. And then as far as the scenarios go, scenario two was on the lower end, and scenarios one and three were on the higher end, with scenario three being the highest amount of non-residential development. In terms of the pattern of development, the scenario one was the spread out scenario, where it had the lowest density development spread across the most land. Scenario two was that highly concentrated development that only opened up a couple of areas for development and left everything else the same, or identified for rural reserve or a priority for conservation. And then scenario three showed a more of a mixed future that combined really different elements of scenario one and scenario two, and introduced more employment. Looking at the rural reserve and priority for conservation, There is not a consistent strategy for that in this area today, aside from the current adopted future land use map. But scenarios one, two, and three seek to establish some sort of priority for how that could be done. Scenario one is the lowest, and scenario three is the lowest as well, in terms of the amount of land set aside for that orange designation on the maps. Scenario two is the highest, that showed the most orange on the map, set aside for that purpose. When it comes to the wildlife corridor, the wildlife corridor was shown on scenarios one, two, and three to different extents. It was partially completed in scenario one and scenario three. In scenario two, it was the most complete. Again, connecting the Little Manatee River south through the Cockroach Creek Preserve and then out to Tampa Bay. And then in the current plan, significant portions of those wildlife corridors are privately owned and do have some development permitted on them currently. As far as infrastructure phasing goes, that concept really isn't significantly addressed in the current plan. It is spoken to in the Little Manatee South Community Plan, um, but more as an aspirational priority rather than a strategy. Scenarios one, two, and three speak to how infrastructure should or shouldn't be phased, and establish triggers for when that would occur using that 2050 um, the 2050 threshold that was shown on the map. Let's see. And then now we're going to touch on each of the boards that we set aside that focused on the different departmental areas within the county. We'll touch on the technical review findings and the highlights, but all of these are going to be available for you on the website, as well as able to be accessed again prior to completing the survey on each of the scenarios. So we asked the Conservation Environmental Lands staff at the county to provide input on each of the scenarios, just some key findings from them. Preserves in general require prescribed burns and invasive plant control. The more development abuts a preserve, the more costly the management of that land becomes. Scenario two's separated growth areas keep corridors to Cockroach Bay and the Little Manatee River open. The department was very clear to say that no wildlife corridor exists today. The scenarios and the master development process create the opportunity to establish one. And then, based upon the department's assessment, scenario three would be the least demanding to manage, provided the recommended conservation land is acquired or placed into a conservation easement. So that's a really important distinction. Scenario two is the least demanding to manage, provided that the recommended conservation land is acquired or placed in conservation easement. So that's an important finding that we're going to carry forward, and that we've incorporated into the recommendations at the end. As far as schools goes, I believe it was mentioned in at least one of the maps, but there's a significant amount of land already under ownership of the Hillsborough County Public Schools. Um, as far as the number of students generated by each of the three scenarios, scenario one was the highest, and scenarios two and three were about the same. Any of the scenarios would require about three elementary schools, one middle school, and one additional high school. And the school district did indicate that the land they currently have banked off of US 41 would likely be enough land to provide those facilities onto. They don't have the resources to pay to build them. However, that would be addressed through the master development process and through the payment of impact fees to build those facilities. Economic development provided input as well, looking at the amount of jobs that would be provided beyond the year 2050 into the future. Um, the department also looked at each of the land uses in the place types and evaluated them against the targeted industries specifically established by the state and the Florida Target Industry Report, which focuses on prioritizing higher wage jobs, the preference by the department was toward a blended strategy of different employment types, um, and focus at the planned I-75 interchange, which again is a placeholder location. The study of that interchange is looking somewhere between the Manatee County line and the Little Manatee River. That location is subject to a determination by FDOT in the future. The three industries or the three types of land uses that equate to target industries that would look to be specifically focused on in these areas. The industrial and logistics land uses would enable advanced manufacturing, logistics and global trade, aerospace innovation, maritime, and energy security. The office and research park land uses would look to specifically enable things like corporate headquarters, information technology, financial and professional services, life sciences, military and defense, as well as research and development. And then the agricultural land uses, which we also want to emphasize because that's the predominant land use that exists today. Ag land uses would enable the modernization of local resources for sustainability-related industries, such as advanced aquaculture, genetically enhanced forestry, and automated farming systems. Looking at public works and stormwater, the technical review findings noted that there really was negligible difference at this point in time between each of the scenarios. All three would significantly increase maintenance needs, and the new stormwater systems required would be built according to adopted technical standards. The maintenance funding gap as well was mentioned. There is currently a maintenance funding gap, and it is likely to increase under any scenario. And this aligns with the presentation given to the Board of County Commissioners on June 17th. So if you're interested in more information about that, we, I believe, have a link to that presentation on this project website. Water and wastewater, significant information was provided from water and wastewater. Under the current plan, the study area remains, of course, outside the urban service area, so the county is not obligated to extend central water or wastewater service, and as a result, property owners are not required to connect. Development under the current plan would continue to rely on wells and septic systems primarily. The South County Regional Advanced Wastewater Treatment Facility is permitted for about 13 million gallons per day. All three scenarios stay within that by 2050. Beyond 2050, scenarios 2 and 3 exceed it, and the department would plan to expand the facility to 16 to 18 million gallons per day as a result if scenarios 2 and 3 beyond 2050 were to proceed. A scenario selected for 2050 sets a development pattern that continues past it. The 2050 figures are closer together. What separates the scenarios is the capacity commitment created beyond 2050 before the expansion is funded or scheduled. Another key point the department pointed out is the further from existing utility infrastructure and the less dense an area is developed, the higher cost per unit of service. Potable water treatment capacity is sufficient currently for the 2050, all three 2050 scenarios. The constraint is transmission capacity from the plants to future customers, and the shortfall is currently unknown. New water supply sources are already needed in the South Central service area, independent of this expansion. An urban service area expansion would change the timing of Tampa Bay water supply projects. It wouldn't necessarily change the process needed to achieve them. No funds are currently programmed in the county's capital improvement program to accommodate any of the growth shown on scenarios 1, 2, and 3. Two existing projects, the Ruskin potable water transmission main and the Sharp 6 reclaimed water transmission main, could be sized for future growth downstream. For scenarios 2 and 3, conservation areas between development hubs could create long dead-end mains, which is not desirable, and the department would prefer a looped system for water quality and system redundancy. Extending from the existing urban service area along US 41 is the lowest cost direction because that is where existing infrastructure and program projects already are. For transportation, the technical review findings and highlights, the current plan generates the least amount of travel across all three scenarios because it permits far less development. Um, Compact scenarios would shorten those household trips. So scenario one's dispersed pattern drives the most household travel. The scenario two scenario generates more commercial and freight travel for the larger job base. Higher driving scenarios two and three reflect far more jobs, not less efficient movement. Travel figures are preliminary pending model runs that will be conducted in the fall. The current plans in this context include the adopted long-range transportation plan and the transportation improvement program. And now I'll ask Fatima from our public engagement team to speak a little bit to what we've heard coming into round three and also moving out of round three, what we're hearing as a result of the first few meetings.
Thanks, Stephen, and thank you to each of you who have been putting a lot of your comments into the Q&A. We've been trying to answer those as we go. Please note, we are still in the middle of this process, so keep them coming. This is just what we've heard so far. One of the biggest ranked priorities from both the survey, these comments, in person and in these virtual meetings, number one, consistently continues to be to protect the natural areas and connect a potential wildlife corridor. We also heard a big priority is to keep the rural character and the working farmland in this area, as well as to put infrastructure in place before any development. We heard specifically from the Sundance community to keep any development away from Sundance. And we also heard overall in the area to address the current flooding, drainage, and low-lying land that is an issue. And we also heard that you all are very passionate about keeping housing attainable with local services, but no strip mall sprawl. So we hope that some of those scenarios address those concerns. As Stephen has mentioned before, your input connected directly to these scenarios. We showed that slide that showed some of those comments and how they related to some of those different locations. And yeah, as it says there, if there is something that cannot be measured, we describe the difference between the relative comparisons, which is what Stephen just went through. I'm going to put in the chat if you guys have additional comments besides what is being going on in the Q&A chat, please email our project website. We also have a survey that you all can take at the end of this meeting, and you can submit public comment as well. Even if you said something already, you can continue this, or if we're missing something, please let us know. Thanks, Stephen.
Great. So again, what we tried to do was take the highest priority concerns that you expressed to us and quantify them in some way to provide a way to compare each of the scenarios back to the current plan. And again, the goal of this is not to take one scenario or the other and move it forward. The goal is to take all three scenarios and the current plan, look at the best information and the best ideas from all of them, including ideas that we are going to be putting forward here in the next couple of slides, and build a preferred scenario that moves forward the best aspects of all of them. Looking at just a couple of those areas in more detail, the natural areas, wildlife corridors, and flooding. Again, we ranked each of the scenarios as best as we could based upon how that could be measured, both using the rural reserve priority for conservation, um, place type, as well as overall development footprint as a proxy for flood exposure, as well as habitat connectivity, looking at the wildlife corridors that could be reconnected. The I-75 interchange, this is one that focused on more so the development around a potential interchange, not necessarily the specific location. Again, the location itself is going to be studied for somewhere north of the Manatee County line and south of the Little Manatee River, according to the FDOT feasibility study webpage. You can take a look at that webpage for more information about the study. If you have feedback, we've received a lot of feedback so far about the specific location of the interchange, which we will be incorporating into our recommendations. But based upon the best information to date, looking at each of the three scenarios and how development was assumed around those interchange in that interchange in different locations. Scenario one assumed a small spillover of development east of the interchange. Scenario two, or east of I-75. Scenario two assumed no spillover development east of I-75. And scenario three did have a larger spillover, focusing more on employment-related uses, spilling over on the east side of I-75. Again, the location along I-75 specifically really has yet to be determined, but we of course welcome your feedback on that. Again, we've received a lot already, so if you feel strongly about it, please feel free to convey that. A conservation buffer east of 75 was also identified and recommended, mainly I think as a buffer for the Sundance community. Scenario one showed the largest conservation buffer. Scenario two showed more of a medium conservation buffer. And then scenario three showed the narrowest conservation buffer. All three buffers focused mainly on the Curiosity Creek corridor that is just to the east of the interstate. And so they were not able to fill up the entire area between 75 and Sundance. So that's why each of them are different sizes. For farmland, housing, and local services, again, the measures for this acres with no change proposed, um, variety of different types of housing, and local commercial, the approach to how that would look, either in a dispersed format or in more concentrated town center formats. Again, each of the scenarios ranked perform differently with regard to those three items. And then just some general concepts and really responses that were themes across all the scenarios. We heard, definitely loud and clear that infrastructure needed to be considered before development was approved. This is addressed through infrastructure, could be addressed through infrastructure-driven phasing under any scenario. The Water and the Wastewater Board did speak to this a little bit, and so that's something that we would like to further investigate, establishing commitments that would need to be met before any future expansion would be considered. Solar farms, that was mentioned several times in the public outreach so far. Um, just responding to that briefly, state law makes solar a by right use on agricultural land, which means it's preempted by the state. So if you have agricultural land, you are already allowed to put solar on it. And it limits what the county can do to buffer and landscape solar. So it's not assigned by scenario. What we did is we identified which place types incorporated agricultural uses, and that's where solar would be a potential outcome. So agricultural easements are one of the few tools to keep uh, farmland from converting. But we are flagging the concept of solar and the implications of the state preemption for consideration as we go forward into round four, because we want to be aware of what those implications are. Uh, Growth from the south presents opportunities. This area does, of course, abut Manatee County to the south, and there has been significant development activity, uh, uh, residential areas, commercial areas, as well as roadway connections planned, including an east-west road that is proposed to be built by the developers to the south, south of the county line, that would connect US 301 to I-75 and potentially to 41. This road could serve as a major part of a future Sundance bypass by rerouting cut-through traffic off Lightfoot Road and Butch Cassidy Trail. We'll speak more to this in the idea boards, but any alternative corridors in the project area are something we want to be aware of, and even if it's not necessarily in the Hillsborough County jurisdiction. And then trust and follow through. This is something that we heard throughout the first, both two rounds. Residents were skeptical and were wanting to make sure their input actually mattered. Reflecting these priorities and addressing specific road, drainage, and safety issues were all raised, and we want to acknowledge to you that we believe that's how trust needs to get earned with this process going forward. So looking at the ideas that we've developed so far that would be carried forward for future refinement potentially is the next two slides. The first is again refining that idea of a greenbelt conservation corridor. So we would establish conservation as an overall community goal for a greenbelt that would be connecting key environmentally sensitive areas across the study area, from the Little Manatee River down to the Cockroach Creek Greenway, using a Curiosity Creek as sort of an alignment to get there, and then west out to Tampa Bay. This would be coordinated with the county's Conservation and Environmental Lands Program, and the implementation of this could be combined through a number of methods, from voluntary acquisition or property dedication, retention of existing low density and low intensity land uses, so no change to the comprehensive plan maps, and conservation easements that either allow continued low density use or revert to conservation, or excuse me, revert to land preservation. So essentially taking agricultural land and entering into voluntary easements with those agricultural property owners for land that's still operating as agriculture, and compensating them for the development rights that they would have had, and then allowing those lands in the future, once the agricultural uses cease to operate, allowing those lands to revert to preservation and come under county ownership or some other third-party ownership, but a commitment nonetheless. So again, that is a potential idea that could be investigated further, if you all think it's a good idea. An east-west bypass around Sundance. I think this was mentioned previously. This is something to address the potential for cut-through traffic through Sundance that was documented. We know Lightfoot is really the only east-west road to get from Valroy east to 301. So that potential corridor could sit either in Hillsborough County or in Manatee County near the county line. This is all in theory. We would want to evaluate what existing easements or corridors exist where available, along with land acquisition and voluntary dedication. And we want to do this in coordination with Manatee County. There is an east-west road planned in Manatee County. We would want to make sure that road is appropriate and more attractive to attract regional cut-through traffic than Lightfoot Road. And so if that is an idea worth pursuing, then we'd like to pursue it further and bring you some more detail in round four. We are also recommending that specific commitments and criteria be established, specific targets before any expansion is pursued beyond the year 2050. These are requirements that would be essentially a phasing strategy and would keep the land beyond 2050, the area that was shown in the beyond 2050 shading, in a reserve until the nearer growth area has been delivered and has been delivered in the manner that was promised. So one of the ways to do that is really the next recommendation, which is looking at those 2050 phases and setting a minimum density threshold for those phases, those small areas that were carve outs for the initial 2050 phase. By considering a minimum density within the 2050 growth areas, that would be a way to limit land consumption in the future and keep the remaining rural areas intact for as long as possible. When that is paired with the phasing commitments that we've already mentioned, this can help determine how much land the first phase consumes before any further expansion is even on the table. So if that sounds like an interesting idea or something just to investigate further, we can do it. Just let us know what you think in the comments or in the survey. And again, the second set of these so far, transfer of development rights is something that's currently in the plan. I won't speak to that too much. If you're interested, we can provide some resources that explain that, or feel free to refer to the current plan. Facilities in place before development. We spoke to this before. Again, that's the phasing standard that would be applied to each of the different public services and utilities. Cluster development as the default. The Little Manatee South Community Plan already emphasizes clustering homes as a way to preserve open space rather than spreading that across large areas of large lot residential. We would consider making cluster or conservation development the default in rural transition areas where agri-hood style patterns where farming can continue alongside homes. And we'll show you the slide again that speaks to what an agri-hood is shortly. The future land use categories to guide development may not be adequate in the current plan. So we would look to create potentially new future land use categories to guide development. This is one of the things that was done in some other areas of the edge of the urban service area in Hillsborough County. So we would look at what new categories would be needed to deliver the recommended pattern proposed in the next round. One example that's already been put forward is a commercial only category that would just be for the coastal high hazard area, a category to help enable that agri-hood concept, or a category to enable a specific type of cluster development, again, that would allow for higher density, small lot residential with clusters of conservation around it. And then the last strategy is that the roads and the transportation recommendations in round four be placed into the county's right-of-way preservation plan, the corridor preservation plan, with an acquisition strategy in place before development is pursued. That acquisition could be through conventional methods, right-of-way acquisition, or it could be through partnerships with property owners. But that, again, investigating that strategy to make sure that corridors are identified, that they're adequately sized, and that there's a strategy to actually plan, design, and build them before development is approved is something we would carry forward and investigate in the next round. And then these are boards from round two that we'll just touch on briefly. The cluster development concept again shows you how natural areas and undeveloped areas can be preserved as alongside developed areas. Some examples are the Fishhawk community and New Tampa, where a significant portion of the actual land area is set aside as undeveloped and protected. And then agri-hoods, this is an example of how development can be clustered in more of an agricultural community using multiple different types of place types, with the predominant place type being that rural residential community. Again, rural residential could be inside the urban service area, or it could be outside the urban service area, or it could occur along the boundary. So this place type doesn't necessarily require the entire area coming into the urban service boundary. And just a couple more slides. The conservation funding strategy was something that we identified as something for further evaluation. What we'd want to do is pair the recommendations that related to the orange area on all three maps, regardless of what scenario, what the preferred scenario looks like. We want to compare. We want to pair the conservation recommendations with the defined funding path, so that recommended conservation areas can actually be protected rather than remaining a line on a map. Why does this matter? The study area can recommend that land be set aside for conservation, but a recommendation alone doesn't really protect it. I think that's something that several of you have mentioned already in the Q&A. Land in the recommended conservation areas remains privately owned, and in most cases can still be developed under the current rules. So without a way to actually compensate individuals that own land privately in order to protect that land, the conservation shown in every scenario would stay aspirational. And that's why we're recommending a specific a strategy be created. Possible funding sources include ELAP acquisition of the highest priority parcels, which would need to be done in coordination with the Conservation and Environmental Lands Management Department at the county. Agricultural conservation easements is another possible funding source that would compensate landowners for keeping land in farming or in an open space status until such time that they would be transferred over to the county to be put into a land bank. Environmental mitigation credits generated within the corridor are another potential funding source. Revenue from a transfer of development rights program paid by landowners in a growth area that is not in the conservation area is another source, as well as voluntary dedication of land done for larger sites that are dedicated through the master development process when those come in for development. Carving out pieces and identifying them ahead of time, saying the community has said they want to see this portion of that property be placed into conservation. So that's another potential strategy for implementation. Okay, I think we are at the end of our slide deck here of our boards from the first two meetings, and so your feedback is the next step. We are asking to get feedback on all three of the scenarios, what works, what doesn't work, and what you would change about all three of them. Each comparison board, how the scenarios stack up to the things, especially the things that you said you cared about the most, and the ideas for further refinement. Which ones we should carry forward, regardless of what land use changes occur. We want your feedback on all of it. Um, how to comment. We're allowed to leave comments. We welcomed your comments during the in-person meetings. So we're going to be welcoming your comments online through a survey that you can access by clicking well, not clicking it, but by going to the web link here. You can click it in the chat, or you can use your phone and access it through the QR code on the screen. That survey has a link to everything we just presented to you just now, as well as um, some questions about each of the scenarios and how they compare to one another. Um, what comes next? We're going to be summarizing what we heard from you at the previous two meetings, this week and last week, and what we've heard from you today and what we heard in the survey. We'll identify the strongest elements of each scenario. And in round four, all those elements will be combined into a single recommended map. We'll present the fiscal and financing details for your input, as well as other recommendations and findings about the impacts. And that'll be done so that we can get refinements in place. So if we need to make adjustments to that preferred alternative, we would do that at that time. And then after that fourth round, we would take that as our recommendation to go forward to the Planning Commission Board, as well as the Board of County Commissioners. Um, so that concludes the presentation today of all these boards from round three. Um, we appreciate everybody for participating. And I'm going to see if Sophia has any closing thoughts to make for everybody here.
Yes, thank you. Thank you everyone for joining. I know we went over time, but we really appreciate everyone staying on to listen and provide comments. There are a few questions in the Q&A that we haven't had a chance to answer. We do have those individuals' emails through the registration, so we'll try and reach out to you guys via email to get some of those questions answered. But besides that, we really appreciate everyone's time. Oh, can you hear me now? Um, all right. As I was saying, thank you everyone for your time. I know we went over, so we appreciate everyone's extra time to listen and to provide comments and questions. So we are going to respond to some of those questions in the Q&A via email. We have your email through the registration. So we want to let you know we will get back to you. We just have to close out of the meeting because, again, it was advertised until 7. So, again, we appreciate everyone's time. And please stay tuned to the next round of meetings, which will be happening at the end of September for round 4. So appreciate everyone's time. Thank you.